What happens when the man who destroyed you hands you the key to his own ruin? Nina Vasquez walked into the apartment she shared with Craig, expecting nothing more than a quiet Tuesday evening. Takeout on the counter, maybe a glass of wine, the ordinary comfort of a life she'd carefully built. What she found instead was the slow, deliberate implosion of every quiet thing she'd ever trusted. She didn't break, she didn't beg. She walked out of that apartment with one thought carved clean into her bones, and she walked straight toward the most dangerous man in the city to make it happen. Rusev Nino doesn't do favors. He doesn't extend mercy. He doesn't invite ordinary women into his world. But when Nina stood across from him in that cold, book-lined study, her hands still, her voice even, her eyes carrying something that looked less like pain and more like a loaded weapon, he didn't turn her away. He leaned forward. What happened next didn't just destroy Craig. It rewrote Nina entirely. If you're ready to watch a woman stop being someone's secret and start being someone every person in this city answers to, stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. Let me know what time it is for you. And if you believe the people who underestimate us always pay the highest price, smash that like button and subscribe. Let's see how far Nina's story travels. Nina Vasquez had always believed that the worst kind of betrayal gave you a warning. A missed call that goes to voicemail too fast. A name that shows up twice on a phone screen before the screen tilts away. The specific kind of silence that follows a question nobody wants to answer. She'd read the articles, listen to the podcasts. Betrayal, they all agreed, had a grammar, a slow, legible deterioration that gave you time to prepare. They were wrong. The apartment smelled like sandalwood and weekday normalcy when she pushed the door open at 6:30. Nina had spent 11 hours that day in underfunded community centers and fluorescent-lit offices, fighting bureaucracy on behalf of families who had nothing left to fight with. She was tired in the particular way that only people who care too much get tired, not lazy tired, but hollowed out, the kind of exhaustion that makes the walk from the front door to the couch feel like crossing a city. She set her bag down on the kitchen counter. She called Craig's name. The apartment answered back with a silence that had weight to it, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of something she hadn't been invited into. She found the evidence the way you find a bruise you don't remember getting, suddenly, completely, and with the horrible certainty that it has been there longer than you knew. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was specific and domestic, and utterly mundane in the way only real things are: a second glass on the nightstand, the wrong perfume caught on the wrong side of the room, the small, terrible proof that the life she'd believed in had been running parallel to a different one she was never meant to see. Nina stood very still. She was 29 years old. She had spent 6 of those years believing that Craig Mercer was, beneath his charm and his careful omissions, a fundamentally decent man. She had made herself smaller in 100 invisible ways to fit inside his comfort. She had swallowed her ambitions to match his pace. She had been good and steady and safe, and in return, he had treated her safety like a wall he could lean against while he went looking for something that wasn't her. She didn't cry. The thing that moved through her chest in that moment wasn't grief. It was colder than grief. It was the particular clarity that arrives when a woman finally stops misreading the room. She picked up her bag. She walked back out the front door, and somewhere between the elevator and the street, between the numb silence of the lobby and the night air hitting her face, a thought arrived. Not frantic, not desperate, precise like the edge of a blade. He's going to feel this. What Nina didn't know, standing on that sidewalk in the amber wash of streetlight, was that across town, in a study lined floor to ceiling with books no ordinary man had the patience to read, Rusev Nino already knew her name. He had built his empire on reading people the way other men read contracts. He had spent 2 decades watching Craig Mercer's circle, watching who flinched, who performed, who could be bought, and who was simply waiting for someone to hand them permission to stop being small. He had noted Nina Vasquez the way a chess player notes a piece the opposing side had been using wrong. He had been waiting to see what she would do when she finally found out. When his phone buzzed that night with a message from his associate, she walked out. Took nothing. Didn't look back. Rusev Nino set down his glass and allowed himself something that very rarely moved across his face. The faintest, most dangerous kind of interest. He had not expected her to come to him. She did. 3 days later, Nina Vasquez walked through the doors of the most fortified private residence in the city, past 2 security checkpoints and 1 associate who tried to turn her away, and she sat down across from Rusev Nino, his tattooed hands folded on the desk. His silver-streaked hair swept back, his dark eyes reading her the way he read everything, like a document he was already deciding how to use. She placed a single folded piece of paper in front of him. A proposal, not a plea, not a performance. A business arrangement, structured, considered, and ruthless. She looked across the desk at a man whose name made senators go quiet at dinner parties, and she said, "I believe we can be useful to each other." Rusev Nino unfolded the paper. He read it once. He looked back up at her. And in the particular stillness of that study, green-shaded lamps casting warm light across the shelves, the city murmuring somewhere far below, something shifted between them. Not tenderness. Not yet. Something older and more dangerous than tenderness. Recognition. He turned the paper face down on the desk. "Tell me," he said, "exactly what you want Craig Mercer to lose first." Nina leaned forward. And that was the moment. Not the wedding. Not the headlines. Not the night the city learned to say her name differently. That quiet study, those 2 people, that single question, that was the precise moment Nina Vasquez stopped being the woman Craig had taken for granted. She just didn't have a crown yet. Loyalty is a choice, not a suggestion. If you know your own worth, subscribe. Nina's story is just getting started. The address wasn't listed anywhere. Nina had found it the way you find things that aren't meant to be found, through 3 careful conversations. 2 favors called in from people who owed her from her casework days, and 1 phone call to a man who'd gone very quiet when she said Rusev Nino's name, and then, after a long pause, read her a street and a number like he was confessing something. She'd written it down. She hadn't hesitated. That surprised her, actually, the absence of hesitation. She'd expected to feel fear in some performative, movie-style way. Instead, she felt the same thing she felt walking into a CPS hearing she knew she was going to win, a kind of cold, load-bearing calm. The sort that doesn't come from not caring, the sort that comes from having already decided. The car she'd hired stopped at the gate and didn't offer to wait. She didn't ask it to. The estate announced itself the way powerful things do, not loudly, but with the specific, settled confidence of something that has never once needed to prove its right to exist. Stone walls. Iron gates worked into patterns that looked almost decorative until you looked at the top of them. Cameras positioned with the kind of precision that told you the people who installed them were not thinking about aesthetics. Beyond the gate, a long approach through manicured grounds, and at the end of it, a house that was less a home than a statement. 4 stories of dark stone and amber-lit windows, the kind of architecture that says, "Empires are built by men who sleep well." The gate opened before she pressed anything. They'd been watching since the car turned onto the block. She'd assumed as much. She walked the length of the approach without adjusting her pace. The night air was cold and clean and tasted faintly of late autumn, the kind that strips everything back to bone. She was wearing her work clothes. She'd thought about that deliberately. The structured blazer, the dark trousers, the low heels she wore to mediations. She wanted to look like what she was, a woman who had walked into difficult rooms before and left them having gotten what she came for. The front door opened as she reached the top step. The man who filled the frame was not Rusev Nino, but he had the posture of someone who'd spent years standing between dangerous things and the people they wanted to reach. He looked at her the way dogs look at mail, not hostile yet, but entirely unconvinced. "Mr. Nino isn't expecting anyone." "No," Nina said. "He isn't. Tell him Nina Vasquez is here and that it concerns Craig Mercer. Tell him I'll wait exactly 10 minutes in whatever room you prefer, and that what I'm offering is worth more than 10 minutes of his evening." The man studied her for a moment that stretched longer than was polite. Then he stepped aside. She was led through a foyer that smelled like old wood and something faintly smoky, cedar, maybe, or the memory of cigars. The house was warm in a way that felt deliberate, insulated from the world outside in every sense of the word. There were no photographs on the walls. There were paintings, good ones, original with the particular texture that comes from age, and there were shelves of books that lined the hallway like a library that had grown impatient and spilled out of its room. She was shown into a study. Green-shaded lamps, a desk of dark mahogany positioned to face the door, 2 leather chairs, shelves floor-to-ceiling with books arranged by some logic she couldn't immediately identify, a single glass of something amber on the corner of the desk, already poured. She did not sit. She stood in the center of the room and she waited, and she did not use the waiting to rehearse or reconsider. She had done all of that over 3 days and 2 sleepless nights. She'd written the proposal in longhand first, then typed it, then cut it down to a single page because the most effective arguments always fit on 1 page. She'd looked at it that morning and felt certain, not hopeful, not nervous, but certain, the way you feel when you've done the math and the math is right. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, he moved too quietly for that. It was a shift in the room's atmosphere. A kind of pressure change, the way the air behaves when something significant enters it. Rusevnino came through the study door and closed it behind him without looking at it. He was taller than she'd expected. The photographs, the few that existed, mostly taken at distances, mostly blurred by circumstance, hadn't communicated the particular quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space without filling it noisily. His suit was dark, perfectly fitted, open at the collar. The tattoos climbed from beneath it, up his neck, across his hands, not decorative in the way fashionable tattoos are decorative, but deeply, specifically personal, a map drawn in ink over decades by hands that had their own reasons. His hair was silver at the temples, dark through the rest. His face was not a young man's face. It was the face of someone who had paid the price of being exactly who he was and found the price acceptable. He looked at her. She placed the folded paper on the desk without theatrics. "I'll be brief," she said. "You have infrastructure Craig Mercer depends on. I have 6 years of detailed knowledge of Craig Mercer's finances, relationships, professional reputation, and the specific lies he's told to the specific people whose opinion he most needs to keep. I'm proposing an alliance that benefits us both. I don't want money. I want his complete social and professional destruction, and I want to watch it happen from a position he can't touch." A pause. "I've outlined the terms. The timeline is yours to set." Rusevnino hadn't moved. He looked at the paper on his desk, then back at her. Then, for the first time, he sat down, slowly, deliberately, like a man who has just found the meeting worth taking seriously. He reached for the page. Rusevnino read slowly. Not the way people read when they're skimming for the parts that matter, but the way a man reads who has learned that the parts other people consider unimportant are usually the most revealing. His eyes moved down the page with the unhurried precision of someone who has never once needed to perform attentiveness. He simply was attentive, in the focused, predatory way of a person for whom missing details has always had consequences. Nina didn't fill the silence. She'd learned that in mediation rooms years ago, that silence is a kind of pressure, and most people, given enough of it, will rush to relieve it by saying something they hadn't planned to. She stood where she was and let the room be quiet and watched him read without watching him too obviously. He turned the page over, read the reverse. Then he set it down, folded it once along its original crease, and placed it parallel to the edge of the desk with a precision that felt unconscious. The habit of a man whose environments always reflect the order inside his mind. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a social worker." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an insult. It was the opening move of a man reassessing the board. "I am," Nina said. "You spent 6 years in community advocacy. You've never held a financial account in a name other than your own. You have no criminal record, no associations with anyone in my world." He paused. "Craig Mercer chose you specifically because you were clean, because you made him look trustworthy by proximity." The accuracy of it landed somewhere tender. She didn't let it show. "Yes," she said, "he did. And now you're in my study at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, offering me opposition research on a man I've known for 4 years, in exchange for—" He glanced once at the folded page. "Logistical support, access, and a marriage of convenience to be dissolved within 18 months at mutual discretion." He said marriage of convenience the way other people say quarterly projections. Flat, analytical, like it was simply a variable in an equation he was running. "That's correct," Nina said. "Why marriage?" "Because it's the only arrangement Craig can't dismiss or minimize. A business rival he can strategize against. A woman who moves on, he can slander. But a woman who marries the man he's most afraid of—" She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "That's a narrative he can't control. That lives in every room he walks into for the rest of his career." Something moved behind Rusev Nino's eyes. Not surprise. She was becoming certain that surprise was not an emotion he had regular access to. Something more like the specific satisfaction of a person who has asked a question they already knew the answer to and received it correctly. He leaned back. "You understand," he said, "that this isn't a costume. My name isn't a prop you carry for 18 months and return when it's convenient. The people in my world will expect you to occupy a position. They will test you. Some of them will do so in ways that are not polite." "I know. You've never navigated anything like this." "I've spent 6 years navigating systems designed to fail the people inside them on behalf of families with no power and no advocates," Nina said. "I know how to read a room where everyone's interest opposes mine. I know how to find the one pressure point that moves an outcome. I know how to be underestimated." She paused. "I'd argue that last one is the most useful skill in any room." Rusev Nino was quiet. The green-shaded lamps threw warm light across the desk between them, and in that light, with his tattooed hands folded and his dark eyes holding a stillness that most people would have mistaken for disinterest, he was looking at her the way she now understood he looked at everything, not for what it was, but for what it could become under the right conditions. She had the sudden, disorienting sense that she was not the first dangerous thing he had recognized in an unlikely form, that he had a long history of looking at things the rest of the world had misread and knowing better. He stood. He crossed to the sideboard, poured a second glass without asking, and set it at the edge of the desk nearest to her. "Sit down, Ms. Vasquez." She sat. He remained standing, glass in hand, and for a moment he looked not at her but at the middle distance, the look of a man running calculations behind his eyes that he had no intention of sharing until he'd finished running them. "Then, Craig Mercer has been moving money through 3 accounts I've been unable to source for 14 months. If your documentation covers the period between his promotion and last spring, I have a specific use for it beyond the social destruction you're proposing." "It covers 4 years," Nina said. "I didn't know what I was looking at when I filed things away, but I filed everything." "Of course you did," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite warmth, but was adjacent to respect in the way that a blade is adjacent to a surgical instrument. Close in form, entirely different in implication. He looked back at her directly. "I'll agree to your terms. With 2 amendments, the timeline extends to 24 months, not 18, and you move into the east wing of this property within the week. Visibility matters. Half measures in my world are read as weakness." Nina held his gaze. Agreed. He extended his hand across the desk. She took it. His grip was firm and brief, and carried the specific gravity of a man who understood that some agreements matter more than the contracts that follow them. His tattoos ran across his knuckles, and she felt the texture of them against her palm, the map of a life she was about to step sideways into. They released. "Welcome to an inconvenient truth, Ms. Vasquez," Rusev Nino said. "The people who dismissed you just made the worst decision of their lives." Nina picked up the glass he'd poured. For the first time since she'd walked out of that apartment and into the cold night air, something loosened in her chest, not relief, not warmth, but the specific, steely satisfaction of a door swinging open onto exactly the room you needed. She had walked into the lion's den. She had not been devoured. She had been recognized. Loyalty is a choice, not a suggestion. If you believe loyalty is non-negotiable, and you're done with people who play games with the hearts of those who trusted them, hit subscribe right now. Craig's reckoning is only just beginning. The East Wing had its own entrance. Nina learned this on the first morning, when she followed a quietly efficient woman named Daria through a corridor she hadn't seen the night before. A hallway that ran parallel to the main house, but felt like a different country, with higher ceilings and longer silences and windows that looked out over the back grounds, where the city beyond the walls seemed theoretical, distant, like something that happened to other people. Her rooms were not what she'd expected. She'd expected austere, cold, the aesthetic of power in its most performative form, marble and edges and the deliberate absence of softness. Instead, the East Wing was warm in the way that old, serious money is warm. Dark wood, deep colors, curtains that fell floor to ceiling in a green so dark it was almost black. Bookshelves, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. A bathroom with fixtures that had been chosen by someone who understood that luxury isn't about excess. It's about things working exactly as they should, every time, without apology. She stood in the center of the bedroom with her 2 bags at her feet and understood, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that she had just left her life. Not escaped it, left it, deliberately with both hands. She unpacked slowly. Daria had offered to do it. Nina had declined, not from pride, but because she needed the ritual of it. She needed to place her own things on shelves with her own hands, to make the geography of the space hers in some small, private way. Her books beside his books. Her coffee mug, chipped at the handle, a gift from a client years ago that she'd never managed to throw away, sitting on the windowsill of a room that probably cost more per square foot than her entire previous apartment. She set the mug on the sill and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to find Daria and asked where she could get a better coffee. The transformation didn't happen the way transformations happen in stories, not in a single, cinematic moment with a new dress and a mirror and a sudden recognition. It happened the way real change always happens, incrementally, almost invisibly, in accumulated small decisions that only reveal their pattern in retrospect. It started with the schedule. Rusev Nino's household ran on a precision that initially felt militaristic and gradually revealed itself as something closer to a philosophy. Meals at fixed hours. Meetings that began and ended exactly when they were supposed to. A staff who moved with the quiet competence of people who had been selected not just for their skills, but for their discretion. People who had long ago learned that in this house, what you did not say was as important as what you did. Nina adapted faster than she'd expected. Faster, she suspected, than Rusev had expected. She began attending the morning briefings he held in the main study, not because she'd been invited, but because she'd knocked on the door on the 3rd morning, walked in, taken the empty chair to his left, and not been asked to leave. She listened more than she spoke. She asked one question per meeting, precisely chosen, never to display what she knew, always to understand what she didn't. She watched how information moved through the room, who deferred to whom, who spoke freely, and who chose their words like a man spending his last currency. She was mapping the world she'd walked into. Quietly, methodically, the same way she'd once mapped underfunded welfare systems and bureaucratic labyrinths, looking for the load-bearing points, the hidden leverage, the places where one well-placed intervention could shift an entire structure. Old skills, new terrain. Daria noticed first. She began briefing Nina on the household's social calendar without being asked, arriving each morning with a coffee and a short, precise summary of the week ahead, who was coming to dinner, what their relationship to Rusev was, what subjects moved them, and which ones landed badly. She delivered this information with the neutrality of someone who had served in this house long enough to understand that the people who lasted in Rusev Nino's world were the ones who learned its grammar quickly. Nina learned its grammar quickly. She retired her work blazers without ceremony and without grief, Not because anyone told her to, but because she understood instinctively that clothing is a form of communication, and the message she'd been sending no longer reflected who she was in the process of becoming. She replaced them with things that had weight and structure and a kind of quiet authority, tailored, dark, precise. Not costumes. Armor chosen deliberately, worn like a second skin. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. That one was harder. 6 years of shrinking inside Craig's life had installed certain reflexes. The half-step back, the softened opinion, the instinct to make her own presence more palatable to whoever was in the room. She caught herself doing it twice in the first week, and both times felt a cold flash of something that was half anger and half recognition. The third time, she didn't step back. Rusev said nothing about any of it directly, but she noticed, and she was by now very good at noticing, that his eyes tracked differently when she entered a room. Less assessment, less the careful monitoring of a man watching an unknown variable for signs of instability. Something quieter than that, something that looked, in certain lights, almost like certainty. They had dinner together on the 7th evening by unspoken mutual agreement. Neither of them had arranged it. Both of them had arrived at the table at the same hour, and neither of them had left early. They spoke about Craig's financial network for 40 minutes, and then, without transition, about a book she'd pulled from the study shelf that morning that turned out to have been his. He refilled her glass without being asked. She stopped noticing the tattoos as something foreign and began reading them as what they were: a record, a history, the visible evidence of a man who had survived every single thing that had tried to end him. She thought, "I understand that more than I expected to." She did not say it aloud. But she thought, somewhere beneath the thought, that the woman who had stood in that apartment doorway 8 days ago, the one who had gone still and cold and inward, who had picked up her bag and walked out into the dark, that woman would not recognize who was sitting at this table now. Not because she had become someone else. Because she had, for the first time, become entirely herself. Untouchable isn't a thing that happens to you. Nina was beginning to understand that now. It's a thing you decide. The wedding was not a performance. That was the first thing Nina understood when Rusev handed her the guest list on a Wednesday morning over coffee, and she scanned the names and recognized, with a cold clarity, that every single person on it had been chosen as a witness in the most strategic sense of the word. Not friends. Not family in the warm, ordinary meaning. Architects of influence, city officials, financial power brokers, 2 judges, a newspaper editor, the heads of 3 families whose names Nina had only ever heard spoken carefully and in low voices. People whose presence at an event did not merely attend it but certified it. Craig Mercer was on the list. Nina looked at his name for a long moment, then set the paper down and picked up her coffee. "He'll come," Rusev said, without looking up from the document he was reading. "I know." Nina said, "He won't be able to help it." That was true. Craig Mercer's entire architecture was built on access, on being in the room, being seen in the room, leveraging proximity to power into the appearance of power. An invitation to Rusev Nino's private event was not something Craig's ego would allow him to decline, regardless of what it cost him to walk through the door. He would tell himself he was attending to understand the situation. He would tell himself he was in control. He was not in control. He hadn't been in control since the moment Nina walked out of their apartment. The ceremony was held in the main reception room of the estate on a Saturday in late November, when the grounds were stripped clean, and the sky outside the tall windows was the particular gray of a city that has decided to take itself seriously. The room had been arranged with the restraint of people who understand that genuine power never needs to announce itself. No excess of flowers, no theatrical lighting, just the room in its best version of itself, warm and grave and formally beautiful in the way of things built to last. Nina wore ivory, not white ivory, which is warmer, more deliberate. The dress had structure and weight and a long, clean line, and she had chosen it herself from 3 options with the same methodical focus she brought to everything now. She stood in front of the mirror in the East Wing for exactly 2 minutes before deciding she was ready, and then she was. She did not have anyone to walk her down the aisle. She had thought about this. She had decided, after thinking about it, that she would walk herself, not as a statement, not to perform independence, but because it was simply accurate. She was here by her own choice, on her own terms, and the walk should reflect that. She walked herself. The room was full and completely silent when she entered it, and the silence had a quality she recognized from the briefing rooms and the study, the held-breath quiet of people recalibrating in real time. She felt their attention like a physical thing. She did not adjust her pace or her expression. She walked the length of the room looking at Rusev Nino at the end of it, and he looked back at her with the focused, unreadable stillness that she had come, over the past 2 weeks, to understand was his version of being moved. He was wearing black. He looked like authority made human. The officiant was brief. The vows they had written together were not romantic. They were precise, almost architectural in their language, built around words like protect and stand and answer for. The kind of vows that sounded, to anyone paying attention, less like a love declaration and more like a covenant between two people who took their words seriously because they understood what it cost to break it. When Rusev slid the ring onto her finger, he held her hand for a moment longer than the ceremony required. It was not a sentimental gesture. It was a declaration, made in the language of a man whose communications were always more action than word. He held her hand in front of every architect of influence in that room, and the message was delivered without ambiguity to every person present. This woman is mine to protect. Treat her accordingly. Then Craig Mercer made the mistake of laughing. It was quiet, barely a sound, more of an exhale, the involuntary response of a man whose discomfort had found the wrong exit. But the room was silent enough that it carried, and the heads that turned toward him were not sympathetic. They were the heads of people who understood exactly where they were and who they were sitting near, and who had just watched Craig Mercer misread the room in a way that would follow him. Rusev Nino turned his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply turned and looked at Craig Mercer with an expression that contained no anger. Anger would have been too warm, too human, but instead carried the flat, total authority of a man stating a fact about the weather. "Mr. Mercer," he said, in a voice pitched for the room, "is there something you'd like to say to my wife?" The silence that followed was a living thing. Craig's face moved through several expressions in quick succession, amusement to uncertainty to something pale and careful, and he said nothing, which was the only correct answer available to him and also the most humiliating one. Rusev held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to Nina as though Craig Mercer had already ceased to be interesting, which was the most devastating thing he could have done, and he knew it. Nina looked at her new husband. He looked at her. In the warm light of that room, surrounded by witnesses who would carry this afternoon into every significant conversation they had for the next year, Nina felt something settle in her chest like a foundation being poured, solid, load-bearing, permanent. She was no longer the woman Craig had underestimated. She was Mrs. Nina Nino. And every person in that room had just been informed. Arrogant people like Craig believe they can hurt the people who trusted them and simply walk away. Comment justice below if you despise arrogance, and if you believe that bullies, without exception, eventually face exactly what they deserve. The wives noticed everything. Nina had expected this and prepared for it the way she prepared for difficult rooms, by arriving early, saying less than she knew, and watching the architecture of the social dynamics before attempting to move within them. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the sophistication of the scrutiny. These were not petty women. They were precise ones, which was considerably more formidable. There were 4 who mattered most. She'd identified them within the first week through a combination of Daria's careful briefings and her own observation. Mara, who was married to Rusev's longest-standing associate and had occupied the top of this particular hierarchy for 11 years with the serene, immovable confidence of someone who had outlasted every challenge to her position. Lena, younger, sharper-edged, with the specific restlessness of a woman who was more intelligent than her circumstances fully used. Petra and Sonia, who moved as a unit and processed new information as a unit, and whose apparent warmth functioned as a remarkably effective intelligence-gathering operation. They received Nina the way a body of water receives something dropped into it, with a surface ripple of welcome that revealed nothing about the depth below. The first dinner was at Mara's home, 12 days after the wedding, and Nina understood before the appetizers were cleared that it was an assessment. The questions were elegant and indirect, in the way of people who have learned that direct questions produce rehearsed answers. They asked about her background with the cadence of genuine curiosity. They asked about how she and Rusev had met with eyes that were doing something more complicated than listening. Nina told them the version of the truth that was also entirely true, that she had walked into his study and made him a proposal he found interesting. She said it without elaboration or apology. She watched the slight recalibration move through the table like a current, invisible but felt. Mara, at the head of the table, looked at her for a long moment and then said, "He doesn't find most things interesting." "I know," Nina said. "I made sure to be an exception." Something shifted in Mara's eyes, not warmth exactly, but the specific acknowledgement one competent person extends to another when the evidence becomes difficult to ignore. She refilled Nina's glass herself. It was a small gesture. In this room, it meant something considerable. The business dinners were a different animal entirely. They were held at the estate or at private rooms in establishments that didn't appear on any public-facing reservation system, and they operated on a social grammar that Nina learned the way she'd learned everything in this world, by watching, mapping, and then moving carefully and with precision. The men at these dinners were of a specific type, outwardly civilized, expensively dressed, the kind of surface-level charming that gets produced by decades of rooms where the wrong impression costs more than money. They spoke in the layered, elliptical way of people for whom directness is a vulnerability, and they tested new variables in their environment with the patient methodology of scientists who have learned to be unhurried. Nina was the new variable. The first time she attended a business dinner, she had said almost nothing and spent the evening watching how Rusev moved through the room, who he deferred to and why, who deferred to him, where the actual negotiations lived beneath the surface of the conversation. She'd come home and written 3 pages of notes in the small leather notebook she'd started keeping on her writing desk. The second time, she had asked one question at the right moment about a development deal being discussed, a question that landed in the silence after a stalled point and opened a direction the conversation hadn't found on its own. Rusev had glanced at her from across the table with an expression that lasted less than a second and contained, she was almost certain, something that qualified as approval. The third time, she had been seated at the end of the table next to a man named Aurel who was either considering becoming an ally of Rusev's or carefully considering not, and who had clearly been placed next to Nina as a test of something. She wasn't sure yet whether she was being tested or whether Aurel was. By the end of the evening, she'd learned the names of his 3 children, the city where he'd grown up, the specific professional slight he was still carrying from 8 years ago, and the single category of risk he was constitutionally unable to tolerate. She told Rusev in the car on the way home. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant he was doing something with the information rather than simply receiving it. "How did you get him to tell you that?" he said. Not a question, an observation wearing a question's punctuation. "He's been the most important person in every room he's ever been in until recently," Nina said. "I just reminded him what that felt like. People tell you everything when you make them feel correctly seen." Rusev looked out the window at the city moving past. "That," he said, "is more useful than half the intelligence I pay for." Nina said nothing, but she filed it the same way she filed everything, carefully in the right place against future need. What she was building in this world was not a performance of belonging. She understood the difference intuitively, and it was the thing, she suspected, that distinguished her from what these people had expected when Rusev Nino had arrived at events with a new wife and an interesting explanation. They had expected decoration. They had expected someone borrowed from a different world who would sit quietly and look appropriate and slowly dissolve at the edges under the pressure of proximity to real power. Instead, they were getting Nina. She found, with each passing week, that the women were warming by degrees, not softening. Nothing in this world softened, but recalibrating toward a respect that felt earned rather than granted. Mara had begun consulting her on the seating arrangements for large dinners, which in the language of this world was an invitation into the inner circle's operational logistics. Lena had started arriving early to events and positioning herself in Nina's vicinity, with the studied casualness of someone who wanted proximity to a particular gravitational field. Even Petra and Sonia had stopped asking questions with two meanings and started asking questions with one. Nina had not conquered this world. She had done something more durable than that. She had made herself necessary to it. It started with a discrepancy so small that most people would have filed it under coincidence. Nina was not most people. She had spent 6 years in systems designed to obscure the truth through volume, mountains of paperwork, labyrinthine procedures, bureaucratic noise, engineered to exhaust the people trying to navigate it. She had learned in those years that the truth didn't hide loudly. It hid in the gap between what a document said and what the same document implied. It hid in the detail that didn't quite align with the detail 3 pages earlier. It hid in the thing that almost made sense, but didn't, if you slowed down long enough to notice the almost. She noticed the almost. It was a dinner guest list, the 3rd revision of one she'd been working on with Daria for an event 2 weeks out. The 2nd revision had included a name Nina didn't recognize, a man listed simply as a financial associate with connections to the Eastern Development Corridor they'd been quietly acquiring interests in. She'd noted him, researched him lightly, moved on. Unremarkable. On the 3rd revision, he was gone. Not moved, not replaced. Simply absent, with no explanation and no gap where his name had been, the list renumbered smoothly as though he had never appeared on it at all. Nina read the list twice. Then she went and found the 2nd revision in the folder she kept of all working documents, confirmed the discrepancy with her own eyes, and sat very still for a moment at her writing desk with the particular quality of stillness that arrives not when something frightens you, but when something clarifies. Someone had accessed the household's internal planning documents and made a quiet, careful edit. The kind of edit designed to be invisible. The kind of edit that only becomes visible to someone who keeps everything. She didn't go to Rusev immediately. She went to her notebook first. She wrote down what she knew, what she could verify, and what she was inferring in 3 separate columns, a habit from her casework days when the difference between fact and inference had been the difference between an intervention that held and one that collapsed in a hearing room. Then she spent 2 days moving through the house with the unhurried, sociable ease she'd been cultivating for weeks, having the same conversations she always had, attending the same briefings, sitting at the same dinners, and watching. She was looking for the person who was being too careful. In her experience, the people who were hiding something didn't behave erratically. Erratic behavior was the signature of amateurs. The ones who were genuinely dangerous were the ones who behaved with a slight, studied excess of normalcy, who were perhaps 5% more relaxed than the situation warranted, who laughed a half-beat too readily, who made eye contact with the practiced consistency of someone who had reminded themselves to make eye contact. She found him on the 2nd day. His name was Dmitri. He had been with Rusev's operation for 7 years and sat in the inner briefings as a logistics coordinator, present at enough meetings to absorb significant operational detail, unremarkable enough in his position to be looked through rather than at. He was competent, quiet, and had the specific unremarkability of a man who had worked hard to have no edges worth catching on. Nina had sat next to him at 3 separate briefings and found him entirely forgettable. That was, she now understood, precisely the point. What she noticed on the 2nd day was not dramatic. It was the way he held his phone under the table during a briefing, not the furtive, obvious concealment of someone sneaking a glance at a message, but the relaxed, confident positioning of someone who had done this many times and stopped being anxious about it. His eyes stayed forward. His expression was attentive. His thumb moved once, briefly, below the table's edge. She noted the time. That evening she asked Daria, with the conversational ease of someone making small talk, whether Dmitri had been at the estate the previous Thursday, the night the guest list had been accessed. Daria said yes, he'd stayed late for a secondary meeting. She said it without any particular weight, because it had none for her. It had weight for Nina. She went to Rusev that night after dinner, when the house had settled into its late evening quiet, and he was in the study with the particular focused stillness that meant he was working through something he hadn't resolved. She closed the door behind her and placed her notebook on the desk, open to the page with 3 columns. She walked him through it without editorializing. The discrepancy, the timeline, the behavioral observation, the corroborating detail from Daria. She presented it the way she'd once presented case findings to oversight boards. Clearly, sequentially, with the evidence mapped to the inference at each step so the logic was visible and could be tested. When she finished, the study was very quiet. Rusev looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then he looked at her. 7 years, he said, not with anger, with the specific, cold register of a man updating a calculation that he'd believed was settled. The ones you trust longest are the ones with the most time to become useful to someone else, Nina said. Rusev closed the notebook. He leaned back, and in the green-shaded light of the study, with the city sealed somewhere beyond the stone walls, he looked at Nina Vasquez, at his wife, with an expression that had moved fully and without ambiguity past assessment, past interest, past the careful professional respect of the past several weeks. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has decided, without reservation, to rely on. "How long have you known?" he asked. 2 days, she said. "I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you. In my world, you don't make accusations you can't finish." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. It didn't reach warmth. It didn't need to. "In my world either," he said. He reached for his phone. Dmitri would not be attending the dinner. Deception is always the weapon of the weak, because the strong don't need it. If you see through snakes and manipulators, subscribe to the channel right now. Don't let the deceivers win. They came on a Tuesday. Which was, Nina would reflect afterward, exactly when you'd expect them to come. Not on a night with an event, not during a weekend when the estate ran at full operational capacity, but on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when the schedule was light and the house had the particular settled quality of a day without theater. Routine was the enemy of vigilance. Whoever had planned this understood that. Dmitri had told them a great deal before he was removed from the equation. That much became clear in the aftermath. He had told them about the Tuesday schedule. He had told them about the East Wing entrance. He had told them, presumably, that Nina was the newest and therefore most vulnerable point in Rusev Nino's architecture, that taking her would destabilize him in ways that attacking his operation directly could not. What Dmitri had not told them, because Dmitri had not known, was that Nina had asked Rusev 3 weeks ago to walk her through the estate's security protocols. Not because she was afraid. Because she was a woman who believed that understanding your environment completely was not paranoia but arithmetic. She knew where every camera was. She knew the response time from the gatehouse. She knew which corridor between the East Wing and the main house had no blind spots and which one had 2. She was in the one with no blind spots when they came through the East Wing entrance. There were 3 of them, professional in their movement, fast, with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. They came in hard and quiet, and they had done their research, because they moved directly toward the East Wing with no hesitation, no searching. They knew where they were going. What they didn't know was that Nina had already seen them on the monitor in the small security room. She'd made a habit of passing through each afternoon, and that she had sent a single 2-word message to Rusev's head of security 40 seconds before they breached the entrance, and that she was now standing in the main corridor with the calm, load-bearing stillness of a woman who had decided she was not going to be a victim today or any other day. She didn't run. Running was the response they'd planned for. She could see its logic. She runs, They funnel her toward the east entrance. They contain her in a space they'd already mapped. It was a clean plan. She declined to participate in it. Instead, she moved deeper into the main house, through the study corridor, through the door that required a code she'd been given on her second day and had never once forgotten. She sealed it behind her. She put her back against the wall beside the door and she breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way she'd once breathed through CPS hearings where children's lives were in the balance and panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She waited. The door held for 40 seconds. Then she heard them on the other side, the controlled urgency of men adjusting to a target that wasn't where they'd expected it. Voices low, movement redistributing. And then, from the other end of the corridor, something else entirely. Rusev's security team moved without sound, which was the thing that distinguished them from people who had merely been trained to be dangerous, as opposed to people who had become it. Nina didn't hear them arrive. She understood they were there because the voices on the other side of the door stopped with the abruptness of men who had just recalculated their odds and found the number insufficient. What followed was brief and without theater. She didn't open the door until it was over. She had made this decision consciously, not from fear, but from the same clear-eyed pragmatism she brought to everything. She was not trained for whatever was happening in that corridor. Her value in this situation was to not become a complication. She stayed where she was, back against the wall, and she listened to the sounds of Rusev's world handling itself, and she felt, beneath the adrenaline and the hard, steady beat of her own pulse, something unexpected. Not relief. Resolve. Rusev came for her himself. She heard his specific knock. 3, then 1, the pattern they'd settled into without ever formally agreeing to it, and she opened the door. He looked at her with an immediate, sweeping assessment that moved from her face to her hands to her feet, and back to her face in the time it took to draw a breath. Checking her the way a man checks something he values for damage. Finding none, his expression shifted, not to relief exactly, but to a settling, the way a structure settles when the load proves manageable. You moved to the main corridor, he said. East Wing had blind spots, Nina said. Something moved through his eyes. I know, I had them put there deliberately. I know, she said. That's why I didn't use it. He held her gaze for a long moment in the quiet of the corridor. Then he reached out and adjusted the collar of her jacket, a small, precise gesture that had nothing to do with the collar and everything to do with needing to confirm through touch what his eyes had already told him. The men who sent them, he said quietly, will understand very shortly what it costs to reach for what belongs to me. His voice carried no heat. Heat would have implied uncertainty. This was the flat, absolute register of a man stating the terms of a natural law, cause and effect, action and consequence, the cold mathematics of a world where debts of this kind were always settled in full. Nina nodded once. Good, she said. She meant it without reservation. The woman who had once spent her days fighting bureaucratic systems on behalf of the powerless understood something now that she hadn't fully understood before, that there were rooms where gentleness was the appropriate instrument, and rooms where it was simply the wrong tool entirely. She was standing in the latter, and she was no longer carrying the wrong tools. Cowards who attack from the shadows always believe they've chosen the safer option. They haven't. Like this video, if you stand with the strong, and if you believe that what comes for cowards is exactly what they deserve. 3 months after the Tuesday they came for her, Nina chaired her first operational meeting. It hadn't been formally designated as hers. There had been no announcement, no transfer of authority, no moment where Rusev said, "This is now your table." It had simply evolved, the way things in this world evolved, through demonstrated competence accumulating past the point where any other arrangement made sense. Rusev had been managing a situation in the Eastern Corridor that required his full attention. The meeting needed to happen. Nina had sat at the head of the table and opened it, and the men in the room, men who had spent their careers reading power with the accuracy of instruments calibrated for exactly that purpose, had oriented toward her without hesitation. She had noticed this. She had not remarked on it. She ran the meeting in 50 minutes. resolved two outstanding disputes through a combination of financial logic and the specific social pressure that only someone who knew every person in the room well enough to understand their individual thresholds could apply, and adjourned with 3 clear action items and no ambiguity about who was responsible for each. Afterward, Mara had found her in the hallway and said, simply and without preamble, "You were always going to be good at this." Nina had said, "I know." Not from arrogance, from the particular, quiet confidence of a woman who had finally stopped being surprised by her own capability. Craig Mercer's professional dissolution had been neither sudden nor merciful. That had been intentional. The sudden kind makes noise, generates sympathy, allows a man to position himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. What Nina had designed, and it was, in the most precise sense of the word, a design, was the gradual, compounding kind. The sort that looks, from the outside, less like an attack and more like the inevitable consequence of a man finally being seen clearly. It had started with the financial documentation she'd handed Rusev in those first weeks. 4 years of carefully filed records that mapped, for anyone who knew how to read them, the exact architecture of Craig's hidden accounts and the less-than-legal channels through which certain funds had moved. Rusev had deployed that information with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that the right intelligence released at the right moment was worth 10 times the same intelligence released immediately. The regulatory inquiry had arrived at Craig's firm in February, quietly, officially, with the specific momentum of something that, once set in motion, does not stop. Then the professional associations began their own distancing. Subtle at first, the unreturned calls and the mysteriously unavailable calendars of men who had once made time for Craig Mercer, because proximity to him had seemed worth something. Now proximity to him seemed worth considerably less, and these were men who ran the mathematics of association with the cold accuracy of fund managers. By March, Craig had lost 2 major clients, 1 board position, and the particular social currency that had been, Nina now understood, the only thing he'd ever truly valued. Not her, not the relationship. The image that the relationship had given him, the appearance of stability, of being the kind of man that a good woman believed in. He had never valued Nina. He had valued what Nina's faith in him said about him to other people. She had withdrawn the endorsement. The rest had followed like physics. She heard about it through Lena, who had heard it through the specific pipeline of information that moved through this world faster and more accurately than any news service. Craig had been seen at a restaurant he used to take clients to, alone, at a corner table, on a Wednesday at noon. The maitre d' had seated him without the particular attentiveness that used to accompany his arrival. He had sat for an hour and left without being approached by anyone he knew. Nina received this information over coffee on a Thursday morning. She felt very little. Not triumph. Triumph was too hot, too reactive, the emotion of someone who had needed the outcome for emotional completion. What she felt was closer to the satisfaction of a proof resolving correctly. The logic had held. The math had worked. A man who had built his entire identity on the diminishment of the people closest to him had discovered that this was not, in the long run, a stable foundation. She finished her coffee and went to her next meeting. The city had learned her name by April. Not loudly. This world didn't work loudly. But in the rooms that mattered, in the conversations conducted over good wine in private dining rooms, and in the brief, loaded exchanges at the kind of events that didn't appear in any social calendar, the name Nina Nino had acquired a specific gravity. People researched her before meeting her now. They arrived at dinners having done their homework, which was the most legible form of respect this world offered. Rusev noticed. He said nothing about it directly. He communicated approval the way he communicated everything, through action rather than declaration, through the steady expansion of what he trusted her with and the increasing frequency with which he consulted her before moving on anything significant. They had developed, over months of proximity and shared purpose, the particular fluency of 2 people who have learned to think alongside each other. Finishing logic the other had started, identifying the flaw in an argument before it was fully made, understanding what a silence meant without requiring it to become words. It was not the relationship Nina had imagined for herself in the life before this one. It was something more durable than imagined. It had been built from the ground up, out of real material, under real pressure, by two people who understood exactly what they were building and why. She was standing at the window of the study one evening in late April. The city spread below in its amber and shadow, the estate quiet around her, Rusev somewhere behind her reading something that required the particular quality of silence he gave to things that mattered. When she understood, without drama and without ceremony, that she was not waiting for her life to begin. She was living it. Nina Nino, not a title assumed, not a costume worn, a woman who had walked into the wreckage of everything she'd been told she was and had built from it something that no one, not Craig, not the rival factions, not the testing eyes of Mara's dinner table, had ever managed to diminish or touch or take. The city below didn't know her whole story. It only needed to know her name. Nina chose her own worth over a broken relationship and walked toward the life she was always meant to lead. Comment, I deserve respect if you know your own value, and if you refuse, from this day forward, to give it to anyone who hasn't earned it.